Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
This is Mad Men Season 5, Episode 11, The Other Woman. This episode was written by Semi Shellis and Matthew Weiner and directed by Phil Abraham. There's a lot in this episode about competing interests, whether it's another job or an illicit romance or an underhanded proposal. As the episode opens, there are tons of male freelancers in the creative lounge. If I'm Lane, I'm going to be really extra frustrated about paying all these people when you're not using Peggy. And the theory is that because Peggy's female, she can't work on a car campaign.
The group of creatives in the conference room, of course, is chasing the Jaguar opportunity.
The campaign idea is something about Jaguar being like a mistress, but without using the word mistress. And Peggy watches through the glass as a lobster lunch is delivered to the conference room for everybody working on Jaguar. It's a little over the top, realistically, to shut her out like that, but I will say, those small things are the best illustration of how you start to feel undervalued or unseen. If you're already feeling valued, you don't need lobster for lunch. But when you already feel undervalued and someone else is getting lobster, especially people who have less experience, it starts to be the claw that breaks the camel's back, if you will.
I think there's also just her creative hunger. This is a big opportunity. This is where the action is. She wants to be part of that. And even if we say that, Peggy can't present to the car guys, okay, that makes sense. But we know Don Draper's going to be doing that presentation anyway. Is there really a good reason why she can't participate and be part of the creative process to come up with the campaign?
Next, Ken and Pete are having dinner with the head of the Dealers Association for Jaguar. And we get to meet Herb Rennett, played by Gary Basaraba. You may have seen him in The Irishman, Killers of the Flower Moon, Boomtown, or as Grady in Fried Green Tomatoes. He's been in a lot of stuff. Even on Mad Men, where characters regularly cheat, you cannot be immune to the level of ick here. Before Herb asks to sleep with Joan, and he doesn't know her by name, he describes her as a dynamite redhead. And he also describes the XKE as a red hot number.
I don't get the sense that Ken or Pete are really surprised at Herb's indecent proposal here.
Oh, I do. I think Ken automatically sees the proposal as impossible. I don't think Pete is surprised.
I think they're experienced account guys. They know how clients behave. It seems to me that Ken goes to shut this down immediately, but Pete jumps in and interrupts Ken when he's about to tell Herb Joan is married.
And then Ken offers, "Oh, you like redheads? I know a lot of redheads." But Herb's not having it. And here's Pete, who was so disgusted by Howard on the commuter train, and he's completely okay with Herb asking for this. And sometimes we've seen Pete does have a conscience, but here, this is a client he has worked to bring in, and he wants the win. That's more important.
I don't get the sense that Ken is morally outraged or ethically against this request. I get the sense Ken is trying to shift the focus away from an employee, Joan, who doesn't do this sort of thing, to a professional. He says, I know other redheads. Herb has his eyes on one particular person, and that's Joan, who is not a professional in the servicing clients business that seems to exist around Madison Avenue. And Pete isn't going to shoot down this idea. He's certainly not throwing cold water on Herb's idea either.
I saw that differently because at the end, when Herb gets up and leaves, Ken asks, "Was that what I think it was?" So I feel like he does have some surprise at this proposal, that this is not regular. And we've seen both Ken and Pete arrange to have women meet up with their clients before. So that seems like that's a regular practice. But I do think Ken's demeanor is at all times please the client, always find a way to say yes. And I think that's what he's trying to do. But I think underneath it, there's a current of this is Joan we're talking about. like we don't do this. And Pete anything's possible for Pete.
Well, and Pete says, you could ask her out. It wouldn't be a conflict. But Herb shuts that down. He's not interested in asking Joan out. That's not what he's talking about here. And I think that really emphasizes the sleazy nature of Herb's intentions. He's not looking to meet someone new. I think it ties in well after Herb leaves the table and Ken says, why didn't you let me just tell him that she was married? And Pete says, because so is he, and he already knows that. So I think Pete is already starting to think ahead as to what might be done in this circumstance, whereas I think Ken is treating it as a closed door.
When Dawn gets home, Megan is happy to see him, but she's also focused on work. So Dawn says, "Oh, you waited up." And she goes, "No. Oh, yes, I did." She actually stayed up to practice lines because she has an audition, and she's really excited. But she takes time to listen to Don. He talks about the Jaguar campaign. And I don't blame Megan for not being enthusiastic about this idea that the Jaguar is a mistress and the wife is the Buick in the garage. And Don goes, "We're not going to use the word mistress in the campaign." That doesn't exactly mollify Megan.
We know Don is feeling creative frustration as they try and get this Jaguar campaign correct. So I think he's a little sensitive when his sexist campaign gets thrown back at him by his strong-willed wife. It's not that he's defending it, really. He's just pitching his sexist campaign to a woman. It's an interesting statement on how Madison Avenue is focusing their campaigns and who they're looking at. Who's going to buy these Jaguar E-type cars? It's men, and there's really not a thought to other demographics.
Megan leaves the bedroom and stays up to work on her audition prep. She's not going to stay to listen to Dawn talk about work or have sex. She's leaving the room, and she's spending her energy on her project. It's not a big deal for one night, but for Dawn, who walks through life having people hang on every word he says, it has to be an adjustment.
Yeah, and I think it's another clear signal of how seriously Megan's taking her choice of acting. This isn't a whim. She is devoted to this. She's going to put in the time and effort to do it. So if Dawn thought this was just an infatuation, he's probably getting the clarity now.
The next morning, Pete shows up early to talk with Joan. He has some flimsy excuse that she sees through immediately, that he has bad news about Jaguar and maybe she can help him break it to the team. And I have the sense it's like when you talk to a toddler and you give them sort of it sounds like a choice, but it's really a non-choice. That's the tone he's using with her here. And that alone is irritating. But when it becomes clear what he's saying, it's also outrageous. Pete is really slimy. Joan knows exactly what he's really saying. And I'm not surprised Pete brings it up, but I am a little surprised Joan doesn't throw him out of her office right away. But I think it's crucial. We saw Pete working Emile Calvé earlier, and here, even though she can see what he's doing, Pete is making Joan think about it.
I think this is a real parallel to that earlier scene with Emile. But what do the accounts people really do? What value do they create? To me, it's a very masterful discussion from Pete's point of view because he goes slowly and deliberately and avoids anything that would cross a red line or be so explicit that it would get him thrown out. That is the magic of Pete's presentation here.
We get several comparisons to legendary women in this episode, and here's the first. Pete talks about Cleopatra being a queen and what would it take to make Joan a queen. Later, we hear about Helen of Troy and even Lady Godiva, and these mentions certainly have to be a nod to the themes here. What are your morals next to temptation? Where do your loyalties lie when you face competing choices and causes? And in the commentary, Matthew Weiner says, as soon as Pete says, "What would it take to make you a queen?" and Joan says, "You couldn't afford it," Weiner says, as soon as somebody says that, now you're negotiating.
And I think Pete has helped her get to that place. We've all had nights in our life where we made choices and all the time trying to maintain plausible deniability that he would ever suggest such a thing. As you pointed out, Joan knows exactly what's being talked about here. She says, "Well, how would you feel if somebody asked Trudy?" I think Pete can detect in her responses it's not a completely closed door, that there is a possibility here. There is an angle to shoot.
In the next scene, Harry wants Peggy to say she's Ginsburg's junior on the call with Chevalier Blanc, but she won't. So then he suggests partner, and she insists supervisor. And that's how Ken introduces Peggy on the call. And I don't understand why Harry resists giving Peggy her due here, because her position relative to Ginsburg doesn't affect him at all. But it's so in character. Harry's one of those people who only sucks up to people if he perceives they have power or can do something for him. And Ken is a person who will credit her with her actual title. On the spot, Peggy comes up with a new campaign for Valentine's Day that's a twist on the earlier idea. She throws out a great tagline, the client loves it, and then she suggests Paris for the setting. And she never says it, but you know Peggy would love to go to Paris for this commercial.
I wondered if this scene was written as a bit of a poke at clients not being the sharpest tools in the shed, just in the sense that the new campaign is a not especially imaginative or innovative reimagining of the original campaign. You know, it kind of swaps the location and ta-da, there's your campaign. And the fact that the client bites into it so hard and is so thrilled with it, it just seemed to me a bit like a poke to say, you know, they don't really know anything and they're easily satisfied if you can just put the right sort of bait in front of them. And of course, you know, Peggy does a great job on the spot here, and Harry and Ken are of no help whatsoever in that moment. It's Peggy who has the idea and rolls it through.
I get why you'd say that. In a next scene, Ken says something about, we're going to do a pull out, and I didn't know what that was. Apparently, there is a term for taking an advertisement and doing different iterations of it. That's what a pull out is. I think in the context of this story, this is meant to show how valuable Peggy is to the firm and how underappreciated she is in this episode. Here she is stepping in, saving the day. So I don't think it's supposed to be an idea that's pulling wool over the clients, like it's providing true value, and it's really a thing that people do. And it's genius because they already have a concept that the client likes. So putting a new twist on it for Valentine's Day, it just makes sense.
Harry and Ken know about pull outs, yet they don't come up with it. So just the fact that they need a creative like Peggy to see the opportunity. So I agree with you. It certainly shows Peggy's competence and ability to contribute.
In the next scene, Pete goes to inform the partners that Herb wants a night with Joan. Can we agree Roger's reaction is the most disappointing? We expect Pete to want Jaguar at any cost. We expect Lane to avoid spending money. So I wondered if Roger brings those roses into Joan in the prior episode and says he'll provide for Kevin and Joan is nice to him about it. I wonder if that changes Roger's reaction to this.
To me, it's very interesting how Pete shades things. And we can already see Don Draper saying, well, you know, he's only one of 3 votes. You know, we only need 2 to get a majority. So, you know, this isn't something we necessarily have to have. Now that the shock of the request is out there in front of the partners, Pete comes back with and starts to pitch why Herb is so important and that there actually may be a possibility of satisfying his request because he's already brought it up to Joan. He portrays Joan's reaction as more amused than shocked, which I think is a not entirely honest assessment of Joan's reaction. And then he goes further to say that, oh, if we brought her the right amount, and this is where Don Draper interjects. But again, it's very masterful by Pete, the account man. And again, these partners have a lot of experience, have dealt with a lot of accounts and a lot of clients. Yet even here, it seems to me Pete is having success in controlling this conversation the way he wants it.
The reactions by the other men in the room continue to surprise me. Here's Bert, who told Joan in the elevator once upon a time she could do better. He's just going to ignore propriety for a chance to represent cars he called lemons. I know he's pretty pragmatic about his business, but this seems like it would be a step too far. At the end, I guess he says, let her know she doesn't have to go through with it. But I mean, that's not exactly standing up for her. And I wish I could trust Don that he's being chivalrous and mindful of Joan's feelings, especially after their drink at the bar, you know, that now he's looking out for her. But just like Pete wants to be the hero who brought Jaguar in, Don wants to be the creative who wins. He doesn't want there to be any doubt that it was his team's work and not an assist like this. And if it were about Joan, I think Don would stay in the room. But it's about his ego, so he makes his declaration and flounces out.
Yeah, I think that's a major motivator for Don here. And he misrepresents Joan's situation. He knows the marriage is over. But when he's trying to dissuade the other partners, he says, she has a husband in Vietnam and a baby at home. The work will be good enough to win on its own. So, like you say, I think he's hiding a little bit behind what they think is the case for Joan when it's not entirely correct. And like you say, he doesn't want to buy the business, through a bribe or through, I guess prostitution is one way to put it, because that would only diminish creative in their contribution here. He wants to win the job on its merits. And if that coincides with, not wanting Joan to go through with this, then he's fine with taking his chances there. What do you think the mix is between the two? Is Don wholly focused on creative and it's got nothing to do with the proposal to Joan? Or if you had to say it's some mix of the two, how much of it is Don as a friend not wanting her to go through with this?
I think there's a slice of care for Joan, but in addition to Don's ego about creative bringing in the account, I think he can see down the road. He's worked with difficult clients before and he knows what that means. Remember Connie Hilton calling him at all hours of night? So I think he can project, if they do this for this particular head of the dealership now, what else is this man going to demand from them? How difficult of a client is he going to be later? I don't think Don, who doesn't even want to sign a contract, wants to be beholden to anybody like that.
Going through with this is not a guarantee they're going to get the business, but that's how Pete portrays the not going through with it. That's not entirely true, but that's how Pete is pitching it. And then when Pete says they should be thanking him because they've come too far and are too close to turning this place into what it should be, now we're going to walk away over what? I think that's really him going all in on this indecent proposal to say this is a way to get an edge that can help us win this business. He's 100% for it. And now all his cards are on the table. Whereas up to this point, I think he's been more passive in his presentation and sort of waiting to see where they landed in terms of their reaction. And it hasn't been favorable enough to this point. So now Pete is going to try and force the issue and get everyone off the fence.
Let's talk about Lane, because I think we have the sense that he and Joan are friends, and he doesn't like this idea for that reason. And Lane could just say no on moral grounds, but it's already clear he'd be outvoted. And they keep steamrolling over whatever he says. He's had that experience when he keeps asking about the bonuses. It's very evident he's concerned about the money. The partners don't know he already got a credit extension, which Pete now says, hey, go get one for Jaguar. So it's the money in the forefront for Lane. But I think there is plain distaste, too. And the look Lane gives Pete on his way out, he might as well say grimy little pimp again, because that's all over his face.
If Don is a hard no and he's out, Pete's still got a majority of the partners in the room, and none of them have said anything near as forceful as Don Draper has. And as you stated, Lane knows their cash position. Lane knows they've already taken another draw on their credit line. And Lane has also written a fraudulent check against that credit line. So there is no finder's fee, even if they wanted to pay it. It's Bert who comes back and says you can't put a dollar figure on the significance of a car. Had Roger sided in with Lane, I wonder if maybe this thing could be stopped. But the fact that Roger abstains, to me, is what opens the door, and Pete can take the opportunity to go forward.
Joan knows Roger so well, and I think sometimes I've lamented that it couldn't work out with him, and we've seen Roger be irresponsible. But this is who this guy is in this moment. Of all the people in that room, who would have affection for or responsibility to Joan? Roger knows he's the father of Joan's baby. He can't stand up for her here. He can't say, this isn't what we're going to do. The account man in him, that's what wins over any personal affection. Maybe he thinks it's actually in her favor because she doesn't want to have anything to do with him. So, okay, Joan, go ahead and do what you want. Get your money. I'm not going to stand in your way. It's not that he likes it, but I do feel him not standing up for her here is exactly the kind of failure that Joan always knew was lurking in Roger.
But does Joan need Roger to stand up for her here? Or does she have agency on her own to say, maybe the price is worth it for her and that she can make that choice for herself and she doesn't need someone like Roger deciding her own morality and values?
Well, I was alluding to that maybe he understood that. And of course, she has her own agency. And of course, she's more capable than he is. But the gesture, I mean, we always talk about Roger's strength is his charm, right? This is not charming. This is dirty, as Sally would say.
Yeah, it is extremely dirty. But by his passivity, I think at worst we could say he's simply let the ball be thrown into Joan's yard, and now Joan can make a decision on it. Whereas, say, if Dawn stays in the room, if Lane is stronger, if Roger opts against, then they don't even give her an opportunity to make a call here. They just say, hey, our firm doesn't do these sorts of things. And that would be an appropriate stance, I think, for the partners of the firm, right? To say this is how we do business or how we don't do business. Clearly here the answer is, yeah, sort of anything's on the table, and each person needs to make their own choice as to what they're willing or not willing to do towards winning the business.
So Don has Megan's disapproval in his head, and now this thing with Joan and her to get Jaguar. So he goes in and he tells the team, move away from the mistress idea for the campaign. Harry and Ken and Peggy stop in to let Don know about the Lady Godiva spot Peggy came up with. Not only does Don not give Peggy any credit for the idea she had or want to hear any details about it, he's ready to turn that campaign over to Ginsburg too. And Peggy's pushback here is reasonable because Don told her she was in charge of everything except Jaguar. The campaign is her idea. And Don throws crumpled bills at her face. Obviously, he's angry about the way they're going after Jaguar, but you don't get to play the white knight for Joan and then throw cash at your loyal employee without cheapening that relationship.
It's really humiliating and really unfair to Peggy in this moment, especially given Peggy's devotion to the firm and how hard she works. I mean, she's all in all the time. There's just no excuse or justification to treat her that poorly, especially in front of Harry and Ken. It's so disrespectful. And if we ever wondered how much does Don Draper appreciate Peggy, the answer coming out of this scene is not good at all.
To his credit, Ken follows Peggy. He's been a huge advocate for her this episode. He named her as a supervisor on the call. He credits her idea to Don when he tells them about Chevalier Blanc. And when he checks up on her and she says she's not crying, he gives her dignity. He says, I didn't think that. He's being a really good friend to Peggy, and I hate that she tosses it away. And I think in the episode, it's supposed to show how Peggy is like Dawn. She's not valuing the people in her corner. At the same time, it feels out of character for Peggy. I think she might snap at somebody and regret it or be thoughtless, that she isn't cruel. And this treatment here of Ken is cruel.
It really does feel like an echo of Dawn's cruelty to her. As you mentioned, I think it's very unjustified. Personally, I guess I expected Peggy to be crying. And what we see is a Peggy who's just angry, and there's a coldness to her. I think it's a dangerous turn for her character. Once you move from feeling sad and the victim to feeling that sort of rage, that can often be a fuel for change. How much are you going to put up with? What will you tolerate? Where is your breaking point?
The next morning, Lane comes in to speak with Joan, and she pretends Pete never spoke to her about Herb. And Joan is horrified that the partners were discussing it, and she specifically asks about Roger Sterling being on board. When Lane makes this pitch to Joan, it looks like he's being honest and being a friend, and what he's saying is twisted in truth. He says he's made a mistake every time somebody's asked him what he wanted, and in a truth call-out, that he never told them the truth. And it's such a strange lie, because that is true about him. He hasn't spoken up for himself about what he wanted, and he's confessing that, and it's vulnerable. But we know he's stolen money with forged checks and that he desperately needs the bonus. So giving Joan a partnership feels like an empowering suggestion, But actually, it's just Lane's desperation.
Joan hasn't seen this figure that Pete has thrown out. He brings it to her, and I think very consciously lays it in front of her, knowing full well that it is a magnitude of money that would turn her head. But it's interesting because in laying it out and confirming that intuition, he then replaces it with something else which solves his personal problem. In a manner, I think, less polished than Pete. Lane's playing a game here. And I think it's not that he doesn't have concern for her. I think it's just that he's got bigger problems of his own. He's not incorrect. That partnership is life changing in a way a large lump sum of cash isn't. So it ends up being fairly decent advice, I think, for Joan. I'll also just point out, remember when Pete threw the 50,000 figure out, he was thinking that this was a number that brooked no negotiation, that it would be so great that it would just be accepted on the spot. And that's not the direction this is headed.
I find it fascinating that Lane is able to sell this better than he sold to Edwin from Jaguar. And it's so interesting that Pete, who's the ultimate sales guy, is so transparent in his pitch to Joan. When fumbling Lane, he's much more successful in deceiving Joan because this looks like it's about her interests. It looks like it's about him being a good friend to her. And we know it isn't, and she doesn't know that.
And the deceit to Joan still leaves her far better off than she would be if she accepted the first offer.
The outcome is good for her, but his motives, he's really lost the grimy little pimp moral high ground here. He's every bit as grimy as Pete.
Yeah, he's a grimy big pimp. And we can see the look on his face as he exits the office because he knows darn well what he's just done. It's ironic, I guess, that this is a better outcome for Joan that she probably wouldn't have thought of asking on her own. But as you mentioned, the motivation for Lane here is all selfish. He's not doing this as a favor to her. If he wasn't in this situation himself, he wouldn't have suggested this to Joan. That he's not that much of a friend. But in this circumstance, it serves his ends. So there it is. And he plants the seed in her mind.
Next, we have a scene where Pete is at home reading Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown to his daughter. There is the line, "Goodnight noises," in the text, which is funny because later he's going to tell Trudy the suburbs don't have any good night noises. And it's also such a contrast because he goes to work and he's willing to trade sex for money, and then he comes home and does the most innocent thing, reading a bedtime story while Trudy smiles and looks on from the doorway.
Yeah, I think we can see the discomfort of Lane with this proposal. We see Roger has issues with it. Pete is fine with it. It's just business for Pete. It's a means to an end. He's an account guy. You do whatever it takes. She has agency. She can make the decision she wants, but it's certainly not an easy one.
Back at the office, Don is working late and he's fallen asleep in the creative lounge with the team when Megan and her friends stop by. Stan invites Megan to brainstorm with them, and her contribution is, "Jaguar, it's your problem, not mine."
That's a great line.
And it turns out Megan has stopped by the office to visit Don and get a confidence boost before her audition. And if Don feels used, he doesn't seem to mind that much, but he does say, "Whatever this is, it's not for me." But mostly it's been for him, so it's hard to feel pity for him here.
It reminds me of that, is it Bill Withers' song? You can keep on using me till you use me up. Don doesn't mind being used. And if it helps Megan, hey, great. She'll have confidence and she can go win the part. I like that this scene is where Ginsberg sees Megan's power over Don, and it pulls him back to the mistress idea and the power of a beautiful woman over a powerful man. And then we have Julia, the friend, left in the room who's being objectified on the table. So they're very much all back into the mistress idea of this car as some sort of proxy for sexuality, attractiveness, beauty.
Mad Men doesn't usually do blinking signpost arrows at plot and theme, but this scene back in the creative lounge with Megan's friend crawling around on the table while the men are leering at her. I mean, it's, I get it's supposed to nod at the theme. People enjoy dangerous, naughty things they're not supposed to do, but I just found it creepy and unrealistic.
If I think about it from Julia's perspective, this is her power. This is her ability to manipulate, shape people and their reactions. So it's definitely not subtle by Mad Men standards, but I do think there's a fundamental truth here.
And Ginsburg is not interested in Julia at all. And as he stares after where Megan went, his line is, "She just comes and goes as she pleases." And let's be clear, that definitely applies to Dawn as well, but nobody remarks about that with any sense of wonder.
And I think it's another little moment that shows us that Ginsburg is the real deal. Much like Dawn and Peggy, he's a true creative. He's always working. He's always looking at life through that creative lens. So as the rest of the dummies in the room are all distracted, Ginsburg is like a laser beam focused on the campaign. I think that's an important point about Ginsburg's identity.
Back at Pete and Trudy's, we haven't heard Pete talk about Beth, but he tells Trudy it's an epic poem for him to get home, and he's tired and he needs an apartment in the city. This fight is still about the suburbs versus Manhattan between them, but it's also Pete opening the door to cheat on Trudy more often, inspired by Howard from the train. And he blames Trudy. Pete says, "You're dressed for bed at dinner," as if Trudy having perfect hair and makeup would make Pete a more reliable husband.
He's a sleazy liar and he's good at manipulating people and he's working on Trudy here. I like that Trudy sees right through it and she's not having any of it. He probably imagines he can control Trudy or get her to agree to whatever he wants. And I think he grossly overestimates his ability to pull the wool over Trudy's eyes.
And Pete has this line. He says he was in a great mood when he left work. So he isn't carrying guilt about Joan and Herb. In fact, he's enjoying the power of having pulled all the strings of all the people. And then he gets home and he can't do that to Trudy. And we get from this conversation that they're not having sex, or at least not trying for a baby right now. So Pete's marriage and suburban life is still leaving him empty. And it's continues to be interesting how Pete and Peggy both mimic Dawn in different ways.
And what does it say about the firm that the firm is now reflecting Pete Campbell's preferences on how it operates? Anything goes in service of landing the client. It makes sense that something sleazy like this would come out of that because in a firm that's run by prior generation Bert and Roger, maybe there's a much lower probability of getting to this point. But in a Pete Campbell driven firm, yeah, this is going to be par for the course, I think.
We see Joan getting home where her mother is waiting with some unkind thoughts about Greg. Joan's been drinking, but she's functioning. We've never seen her inebriated. And she doesn't have anyone to talk to about this proposal at work. And you'd think somebody like Joan would have lots of friends. But even there, I don't know, is this something she would reveal to a friend? And for all Pete's discontent, I really look at Joan and admire her for keeping her life together as well as she does, because she has to feel pretty lonely most of the time.
Yeah, and that loneliness has to be emphasized in a moment like this where you've got a difficult decision and she can't turn to anyone. Plus, you just have all the irritations and annoyances of your mother's presence. So, they bring up the subject that Apollo is no longer allowed to come to the apartment. The fridge is broken. It's all criticism and negativity. And in this moment, lonely Joan facing a very big, challenging decision needs something more than that. Probably a lot of people hate Mad Men for this type of realism, but I really appreciate it because I think that's life serves you up these types of situations. And that moment when you need the support or whatever, it may not be readily available. And I think that's an important point here. Who does Joan have that she can turn to with this? It seems like there's literally nobody.
In the next scene, Megan is really excited because she got a callback for the Jules Pfeiffer play Little Murders. Dawn is excited for her until she says rehearsals will be in Boston. And he's mad because he wants her to be with him, which is not an unrealistic expectation for a happily married man. But here Megan drops a truth bomb when she says, "You never thought about it because you never expected me to make it." And Dawn didn't think about that. He regularly takes people for granted. Megan, Peggy, Betty. He wants to believe Megan will be around a lot more than he wants her to succeed in her field. So that's where his focus went.
Both of them probably should have brought this up and discussed it. So the fact that Megan doesn't explicitly bring up this point that, hey, if I get something, it could be remote and it could mean me being away. It feels like they're both running a little bit from the implications of the decision for her to pursue acting. They're content not to bring it up until it forces itself into the room. And then you have this friction here, which is not at a great place for Don because we know he's got his frustrations with the Jaguar campaign.
Don's parting shot to Megan is, just keep doing whatever the hell you want, which is pretty funny coming from a man who's been doing exactly that for 5 seasons.
But he's the man. Aren't they supposed to do whatever the hell they want? Let's check with Pete Campbell.
It's a rough gig, Don. So sad for you.
Again, I think it really shows the difference between Megan and Betty here. Megan's not making any apologies. I'm going for this and you need to face this reality. That's not something Don Draper experienced much with Betty.
The next morning, Joan meets with Pete and says there's no negotiation. She'll do it for a voting 5% partnership with documents by the end of the day. Joan is very calm, no uncertainty, no shame, no apology. And it starts out very formally and ends up pretty personally. She's impatient with Pete for not knowing how to set it up. And by the time she's on her way out, she asks which one he is. And Pete says, he's not bad. And Joan answers, he's doing this. So it isn't just transactional. There is judgment about it.
Yeah, I think that's inevitable. You can't avoid it from all sides here. But it's interesting to me because Joan seems very resolute, very decisive, and Pete doesn't push back on it at all. I think in Pete Campbell's mind, he can take that back to the partners and sell that. And again, his sole focus here is on landing Jaguar. So fine, Joan will become a junior partner.
A point here, it does come up in a later season, but Joan is very astute about people, and she cares about having power and respect among her colleagues. So making this decision is going to lead to gossip about how it happened. And no matter how practical or modern Joan tries to be, she's going to care if the secretaries know this about her, and maybe enough to keep her from making this decision. I think we can look at it and say, financially, this is going to set her up for life. She's not going to be beholden to another man for her future. So we can maybe understand her making this decision. We can also understand her ick about it and hold both of those things at the same time. But these other consequences about the questions and about not being able to honorably walk in and say, oh, I earned this partnership, I think Joan would think about that in advance.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not a very savory fact. I don't think Pete Campbell's going to say anything to anyone about it. And I'm not sure the other partners would either, because do they have some sort of mixture or shame or just plain discretion that they don't want to advertise, hey, this is how our firm operates and this is the kind of stuff we do to win business. So maybe everybody has an incentive to keep this under wraps.
Look at what they already say about Peggy with no evidence. The gossip and the rumors about this. I mean,
You can't control gossip and rumors, but that's fundamentally different than an actual leak of some specific details or facts, because I totally agree with you. If she's a minor partner, the gossip and rumors are coming. There's no avoiding them.
Next, Ginsburg comes into Don's office with the perfect tagline for Jaguar. He says, the guy buying the car, one way or another, what he has isn't enough. And we definitely have seen that's true for Pete this season. And Peggy named that about Don earlier when she said, you have everything and so much of it. And this is also the essence of Don's pitch later in the series, that happiness is a moment before you need more happiness. And the line Ginsburg comes up with is, Jaguar, at last, something beautiful you can truly own.
And as we've seen with the interactions with Megan, he can't truly own Megan. It fits perfectly in terms of this campaign. I do think it speaks to a sad truth, I guess, about the type of people who are going to buy these cars and the kind of lives they live.
Yeah, I hate this ad because it's trying to soothe the men who are losing their power and influence over women who are starting to have careers and agency in their lives. And it's kind of funny that Ginsburg writes it because it doesn't describe his life or his needs. I guess just like Peggy said she wasn't an airplane, but she could write to sell one. Ginsburg is so far from this mentality, but he can see the story of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big themes about creative in this series is that putting yourself in the shoes or in the head of the target audience. And we've mocked them a lot when earlier they were doing campaigns for women's products, and we just feel they don't have that grasp of what's in the woman's mind as clearly as they think they do, but they have this arrogance and confidence that, oh yeah, that's what they all want and think about going to this affluent potential buyer of a Jaguar E-Type. It's the same thing. Is that really where all these guys' heads are at?
Next, we get the return of Freddie Rumsen, where Peggy meets him in a diner for work talk. And I'm happy to see Freddie, but aware that Peggy could have had this same talk with Ken, and it would have been supportive and constructive if she hadn't thrown that relationship away. Freddie gets a line that car guys are a bunch of creeps. And we're going to see that in future seasons in addition to what we've seen already. And then Freddie urges Peggy to go work someplace else. And this line he has about Dawn, let him know you're not just some secretary from Brooklyn who's dying to help out. And this idea that businesses pay to attract new talent but don't value who they have. I think that's something that you've seen in business personally over the years, right? Here's Peggy, she's doing great work, but it's to her benefit to move on because she won't get paid or she won't get the attention she would if she switched up, which is weird, right? Because you would think you would be loyal to the people you already have and it would be more efficient. Certainly, you've already trained these people, so why not throw money at them? But instead, we throw money at new people.
Familiarity breeds contempt. I agree with you. In theory, you'd say these are our best people. We know how great they are. They overachieved. They're worth every penny and more. We're going to compensate and look after them to avoid losing them to anyone else poaching them, and as well just to reward this great performance, which is so proven and we see so much of. And practically speaking, that is a rarity, in my opinion, in most businesses. And there's far more common to see the willingness to take a gamble, hire the new person off the street who you're forced to compensate at market rates because that's the only way to get them in. And meanwhile, you've got these great people inside the fence that you can continue to undercompensate because they're not aware of their value or unwilling to change. It pains me to admit that that's the reality I've witnessed in my own career, but that's just the way it goes.
And Peggy isn't looking to move jobs. She's one of those people. She
Well,
she doesn't mind giving Dawn a scare by taking meetings.
I think there's a real evolution of Peggy's thinking in this scene because it starts off about, are you ambitious or do you just like to complain? Then he challenges her to say, is it about the work or is it about feelings? Because if it's about the work, you'd make a move. And I think you're right. At the start of the scene, Peggy's thinking about it is that she's unappreciated. And if she could just find a way to show that she's desirable and her work is desirable at other places, she could use that and throw it in Don's face to get his appreciation and some respect for what she contributes. And she's not even thinking about it as leveraging, oh, I could get a raise or a title or whatever. It's more about just being seen by Don Draper and appreciated. And then as they go through the conversation, I think Freddie really opens the door to her thinking about the possibilities. I know you could succeed out there. I know you could get what you want. And then just the fact that he talks about how Don Draper would do the same thing if he was in her situation, I think that has a profound impact on Peggy. I think in this scene, Freddie is very much a great mentor and friend, challenging Peggy to figure out what she really wants and what she's willing to do. And I even appreciate at the end of it when he says, hey, if you're on the outs, you wouldn't hold it against me to offer my services to Dawn, because I need work. So I think unlike so many others in this episode where they're concealing their true motivations, I think Freddie here is very much a transparent friend and laying all the cards out on a table that is very useful to Peggy because I don't think she was getting there on her own.
That's the moment Freddie really gets Peggy, when he says, if Don was having this conversation with you and he wasn't the subject, he'd tell you to leave in a second. Peggy is Don's protege, and doing what he does is part of her trajectory. So hearing Freddie say that and knowing Don the way she does, the truth is starting to get too loud to ignore. On my first watch, I don't want this for Peggy because I don't want her to leave SCDP and have less time on the show. But I respect her decision that it's time. And I think the Joan plot is so icky that it's more memorable, but it's no accident that these women both make transformative decisions about their careers in this same episode. In the next scene, Pete takes a moment to stop by Don's office and let him know Joan accepted the offer to sleep with Herb and become a partner. And Pete sucks up to Don by saying, whatever else goes on, it's creative that's going to win this account, which I think is Don's concern. But it's not like Pete's words are going to reassure him about that. So Don asks to see Joan, but she's already left. And what he says to Pete is, I don't want it like this. So does that feel moral to you, or is it Don's creative ego and wanting to win for creative reasons only that makes him so upset?
I struggle with where the mix is here. I think there's both elements present. This scene and then the next one, it feels to me like there's a much bigger personal aspect here. The optimist in me likes to think, oh, he's a friend and he doesn't want her to do this thing because that's against his values. But the more pragmatic me, I think, says, well, he doesn't want it said, you didn't win the Jaguar campaign. We bought it.
Next, Don goes directly to Joan's apartment to tell her she doesn't have to do this with Herb. They'll figure something out. Joan thought the entire group of men in the partnership supported this decision, so hearing Don say he said no to it, I think that feels pretty good to Joan. But I don't sense any regret from her, just some gratitude that he cared enough to stop by and say it. And there's a time fake out, because we learn later, Joan has already done the deed and returned home. So it's possible Pete didn't even tell Don about it until it was over, which Pete would know since he probably scheduled it.
And I think in Joan's mind, what do you think Joan thought Don was coming to her door to say at this point? Checking to see, hey, did it go well with Herb? Do we have a shot or, what? Because at this point, Joan thinks he knows that she's gone through with it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't really thought about that.
Or is she just feeling shame and not wanting to sort of face anyone who knows what she's just done? So it's not that she thinks Don is bringing any particular news. It's just she wouldn't want to see anybody at this point who knows what's just gone on. I think she's completely shocked at what Don does say to her and how it becomes clear that he had no idea that she's already done it. And we didn't mention it in the prior scene, but the way Pete portrays it as a 4-0 vote with Don absent and abstaining, it is such a misrepresentation, really, of how things fell out. Grossly exaggerates the unanimity of this course of action.
As Don goes to make the presentation the next day, thinking that Joan doesn't need to go see her, his speech is intercut with scenes from Joan and Herb the night before. So we see Joan arriving wearing a fur coat from Roger when she goes to meet Herb, when she was the other woman. And Herb has bought her an emerald necklace. I just wonder, will she ever wear that again? I mean, this necklace is surely different from Roger's fur coat gift, right?
Yeah, I'm hoping she just turns around and pawns it. It's also clear that this pitch that Don gives, Herb is sitting there thinking of Joan, in terms of being that mistress, that woman he can't possess. It's not the most subtle signal there, but I do really love the look on Joan's face while she's in the room. And it's very subtle, but there's this combination of determination to get through this, but we can also detect the fear and the vulnerability in this moment, and that the doing of this is a lot more difficult than the decision to take this course. I really feel a lot of sympathy for Joan in that scene. Of course, Herb doesn't let us forget what a sleazy, lecherous human being he is.
Herb is every bit as icky as you'd think. Joan is not flirty or breezy. I was going to say she doesn't give very much of herself away to him, but I guess that depends on how you see it and how it affects her going forward. She's not personable. She's not chatty. And the whole time Dawn is talking about how unattainable women are more attractive. And we know Joan has been happy to be admired, and she planned to parlay that into a good marriage. I mean, Herb was not supposed to be any part of her fairy tale. But this is a practical choice if she can put it past her. It's one night, it's one achy man, and she does have a lot to gain. We spend a lot of time talking about Peggy's bad taste in men, but Joan picked Greg and also that boring business guy to show her roommate she wasn't interested. And then there was Paul, and Roger might be a slightly different story, but she has not found Prince Charming.
And I think it's important for this scene that it isn't glossed over with some sort of sense of, oh, it's fun, or they're drunk and they're enjoying each other's company. It's just awful and icky. You really see the price Joan is paying in this moment.
Next, we get to see Joan coming home again and how she had already gone to Herb's before Dawn came to visit her. It plays really well because it's not manipulative or indulgent like some flashbacks are. In the commentary, Weiner said he knew nobody would pay attention to what Dawn was saying if they saw Joan with Herb first, so it's an effective structure.
Yeah, I really love that little trick they play here. I think it works really well. I think Matt Weiner's absolutely correct. And I think it's important because, again, as we talked earlier, how much of this is Dawn being a friend and how much of this is Dawn being Mr. Creative and proud of his craft and serving his own ego. In the scene with Joan, I have to say, and maybe I'm just being sentimental here, it feels like it's friend Dawn. Friend Dawn journeys to her apartment, makes a point of talking to her, tells her she doesn't have to do this. I don't get the sense it's creative director Don Draper.
I do think there is certainly an element of care for her in this trip to see her. So I don't think that that's absent. I just also think his ego to be the hero is the driver.
And it's also interesting how Joan conveys the misrepresentation from Pete that it was unanimous to do this. So she had no idea that there was any dissent.
It's such a Mad Men thing that all these men are in a room talking about Joan and not inviting her into the room, which, I mean, awkward, but also, if we're going to be practical and transactional about it, maybe include her.
Well, she will be included in the next indecent proposal because now she's a minor partner, so she'll have a vote. She'll have a say.
Next, we see Megan go in for a callback. For all her independence in her career and her sexual confidence with Don, here she walks into a room and 3 men on a couch just stare at her. It's not a conversation, she's a product. They ask her to turn around. They stare at her. It feels icky. It's just like Herb diminishing Joan to a sexual object. He has no clue about her business acumen or her intelligence, and these men aren't interested in Megan's humanity, just her profitability.
Yeah, we talked about advertising being a dirty business. I think entertainment, fits that description as well. And similar to the scene with Joan, where there's just no escaping the gritty, dirty reality. I think we see the same thing here with the men on the sofa. She's being evaluated on her physical attractiveness first and foremost.
Next, we see Peggy taking a meeting with Ted from CGC. She's nervous, but she's determined. Let's remember, Don will barely sit down with Peggy and give her his full attention. And here, Ted wants to take her to dinner her first day of work. I mean, this is a huge contrast. And as a side note, I think Duck was genuinely interested in Peggy's work, but there was also sexual interest. And there was always the fact that Peggy belonged to Don somehow. So taking Peggy away was a prize to Duck. And I think stealing Peggy away from Don is a prize for Ted, but at least he makes it seem like he really wants her for her work. We saw him being super persuasive to Pete earlier, so we know Ted is good at wooing people. Ted brings specific praise from Peggy's former client. He compliments the writing in her book. And he says, "I'm tired of people treating this like math. So here's another person who sees copywriting as an art, not just a business. And that really speaks to Peggy.
I think Ted does everything right in this pitch to her. He starts with compliments. He then addresses the fact that she's female and saying he's not caring about whether she's married or going to have a baby. And then even when he talks about, oh, you must have heard terrible things about me, that morphs into Peggy saying it isn't a game, it's her career. And then Ted comes in immediately with that respect and appreciation that she's not been getting elsewhere. And then Ted rolls directly into, what do you want? And Peggy writes down a number. I think in Peggy's head, this number she writes down is crazy. And she's ready for the counter or to have to haggle and the debate and the argument. So the fact that he just takes it back, scratches through it and adds $1,000, just like in the earlier scene with Freddie, where I think she does a transformation from grousing and complaining, and then Freddie saying, look, put up or shut up, and here's how you would put up, and I can tell you the process. It feels like here she's come into this conversation thinking this is, one step of many, and suddenly he's laid all the cards on the table and said, great, we want you, come and do this. And I love the way Elizabeth Moss says, I'm going to need a chocolate shake.
So Peggy's $19,000 a year salary would be worth about $190,000 today. And I think it's also critical that she writes down copy chief. She wants a position of authority, and Ted is willing to give that to her. So that's important.
Yeah, with no debate, no argument, no, oh, you haven't earned it, whatever. It's just check mark. You've got it.
Going back to that Ralph Waldo Emerson essay called Nature and the idea of the transparent eyeball, in this essay, there's a line that says, all mean egotism vanishes. So it's the idea that ideas can pass through you. Ted says the world can pass through you and you can form that into art. And he says, I need a writer. They don't have to be like me. And what a fresh start that would be for somebody like Peggy, who's been dealing with more than her fair share of mean egotism from her boss. So all of this combined is really the perfect deal. And you can see how Peggy is getting exactly what she wants and it all looks good, but it's still hard to leave. This is a big step.
And I think at this moment, she realizes it's a real choice and it's right there for the taking.
Dawn goes home and asks Megan about her callback, and she shakes her head. He's kind when she says, I bet your presentation was great. And he says, I bet you were too. So he's trying. And I think it would be easier for Megan to accept that with a smile, but instead she says, the difference is I want you to get it. And she goes on to say she'll choose Dawn if he forces her to choose, but she'll resent him. And he says the right thing here. He says, I don't want you to fail. But I also think he does want her to fail. He doesn't want her to be unhappy, and he doesn't want to be the cause of her unhappiness. But he also doesn't want her in Boston or busy every evening or living a life that takes her farther away from him.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's saying the right things, but practically, if she succeeds, then all the things he doesn't want to happen would occur. So I think really he does want her to fail, but not in an emotional sense and not as a betrayal of their marriage and the rest. He wishes some way that there was some way they could square the circle, but really there isn't. And the more success she has, the more strain it's going to put on this relationship. So it feels to me a little bit like they're dodging the implications of what her success would look like in this relationship still.
Don goes into the office the next morning, and Megan potentially pulling away from him is on his mind, so hold that thought for a second. And Peggy has asked to see Dawn, but before she can go in, and I don't think this is an accident that this scene is interrupted, right? Peggy is asking for Dawn's attention, but she gets interrupted because the office partners are yelling about which companies are out of the running for Jaguar as calls are coming in.
Yeah, it's only at this point that Dawn realizes Joan went through with the indecent proposal. Joan's not giving anything away in her reaction, and it's very clear that Joan is back to being her normal self. She's owning her choice, her decision, and owning the consequences of it. So I don't get the sense of any regrets on the part of Joan.
Joan and Don exchange a look, but there's no hanging her head or looking away.
No, none. Yeah.
She owns it. I'm glad. I don't know what else they would do. I mean, like, are they going to high five her about this?
And then at the end of it, who's left alone? It's Lane. And Lane knows that all his problems, are unchanged here. So it's good that they got the car, but he's still in a tight spot. And it's a pretty lonely place for him, even in the midst of the celebrations.
The whole office is celebrating, but Don is definitely not. And I feel like he's disappointed in Joan or for Joan, but he's also unsure whether he's responsible for winning Jaguar or if her part was more critical. So now Don has had uncomfortable shifts in relationships with Megan and with Joan, and Peggy comes into his office. And before she starts, Don asks if this is about Joan being made partner, which Peggy didn't know yet. And even though she committed to Ted at this point, I almost feel like if that news hadn't come to her, she might not quite have been able to say this to Don. But Ginsburg's having lobster and Joan is a partner, and she's not going to stick around and watch that happen and stand still. So she takes a drink, and Peggy's standing while Don is seated to tell him the news. Don never saw this coming. He never expected Megan to want to leave advertising. He never expected Joan to sleep with Herb to get the business. He damn sure never thought Peggy would leave.
Yeah, and it seems like in this scene, he goes through the 5 stages of grief, some of them simultaneously. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. They're all there in some jumble. And I think at the start of Peggy's presentation, when Don realizes that what she's leading towards, he thinks he can head it off with a quick raise or throw her a bone or to give her some of that recognition and appreciation that she's seeking. But as Peggy persists and goes through it, I think he starts to realize something far more serious is happening here. And again, I think it just underlines how much he has neglected her, underestimated her, and just simply not given her enough thought as this critical direct report in the organization. It's certainly nothing that he wanted to hear. And the fact that she's going to Ted Shaw's firm is just the brown icing on the cake at this point.
The conversation reminds me very much of Megan's initial conversation about acting, where Don didn't even believe her at first. And he tries sort of desperately to come up with a sales pitch on the fly, and it's not working. So at the end of the conversation, where Peggy holds out her hand to Don to shake, and he takes it and he presses his lips to her hand, I think this moment between Don and Peggy might be his most romantic moment in the series. Even though this isn't a romance between them, and even though he's Don Draper and he slept with everybody and their cousin, and this is a kiss on the hand, but it's lovely and it's intimate and it's meaningful. I'm so happy for them both that he gets to this point in time to act like a grown-up and say a proper goodbye.
Yeah, and it's a great goodbye and a great moment. And I think it represents that reluctant acceptance of what's happening here. And I also think in this moment, there's the appreciation and respect which Peggy had been seeking unsuccessfully for so long, because he doesn't do that to somebody he doesn't appreciate and he doesn't respect. So he's really conceding her point to her in this final gesture. And I think Elizabeth Moss is so great in this scene because she just stands there still and we see tears roll out of her eye. And it isn't Dawn who ends this. She withdraws her hand from him. And we can see that he is just stuck in this moment and trying to hang on. And she's the one who withdraws, which I think, again, illustrates that she's the one in control. This is her decision, her choice, and she's moving forward. If only Don Draper had appreciated her more, and if only he'd shown some of this affection and respect for her, it wouldn't have come to this point. And now the ship has sailed. It's too late.
When Peggy's leaving the office, I find it a little surprising that she can make it out with her things in one trip. I mean, this is a woman who lives at the office, so I know she's got a bunch of stuff in those desk drawers. But she gathers her things, she's wiping away a tear. And I wish they had some kind of goodbye for her. Megan was only there for 2 years, and she got a goodbye lunch. I think Peggy should get one. And I'm feeling sad watching Peggy leave because she is part of the beating heart of this office. When they left with the skeleton crew, she was part of that team. But I'm also really delighted for her when she smiles and steps forward into her new adventure.
I don't think Peggy wants a farewell lunch. I think it would be painful to her, kind of like Megan's farewell on steroids. But I love the smile because the smile to me says, yeah, this was a difficult decision. There's pain with this decision, but she's in control. She did it for her reasons. And I think the smile means she would do it again, even with that farewell from Don Draper. That was the right decision to take, and she's bought into it. And I love that for Peggy's character. She owns her choices and she's looking ahead, not backward. Because let's face it, if she relented and stayed, okay, Don's going to appreciate her for what? Probably a good 4 or 5 hours. And then they're going to be right back where they were. And he's going to have the resentment of feeling he somehow got held hostage to give her a raise or a title or, whatever she extracted in order to stay.
The closing song is You Really Got Me by the Kinks. It was written in 1964, and the lyrics include the lines, "Don't ever set me free. I always want to be by your side." Our listener shout out today goes to Judy H. Thank you so much for commenting on our Spotify episodes and responding to our double dip questions on our website, madmenctz.com. We love hearing from listeners and really appreciate your support. If you like our show and you'd like to give us a 5-star rating or leave us a positive podcast review wherever you listen, we're very thankful to you for sharing any nice things you have to say.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctz.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at madmenctz, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.